This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, we're going to be joined by Media Matters and glad to have on the show someone else for the first time from Media Matters. Always good to talk to all of the great talent that's at Media Matters doing all of the great things that they do. We spoke recently with Julie Tolbert about the media's coverage or lack thereof, good coverage when it came to the Roe decision. I think we all saw that. And again, what Media Matters helps us do is help us to articulate what we're seeing. And we may think we're crazy, but Media Matters lets us know we're not crazy because they are actually looking at it and chronicling it. So when you see coverage and you say, wait a minute, something's missing, or why am I not hearing about this? Media Matters helps us clear that up. And so we're going to do that again with regards to another ruling, terrible week of rulings that last week of the court, from guns to Miranda, of course, with regards to Roe. But what about climate action, climate change, and the EPA? Just another egregious ruling. And so we're happy now to be joined by the senior writer at Media Matters in the area of climate and energy. Evlondo Cooper joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Plain brother. How are you, man?
I'm pretty good. How about yourself?
Just fine. Glad to have you with us. So once again, here's another example. And the good thing about what you all have been doing, I know it's easy to isolate Fox. We can all pretty much close our eyes and do that. But you all are actually looking at all the media and how the mainstream news should be covering it as opposed to how they have been covering it, right?
Yes, sir. We definitely keep our eye on Fox. But also we believe that the other cable news networks and national TV news networks in general that aren't Fox should be doing a better job covering these issues instead of having Fox flooding the zone, dominating coverage and shaping the narratives. So we do try to keep an eye on both, but we do demand that the corporate TV news networks do a better job of covering climate.
Well, first of all, I know over time, you all have looked at the coverage of climate in general, not just this ruling.
Yes.
And that's kind of been declining, hasn't it, in terms of the actual raw coverage of what's happening with climate, right?
And so my colleague, Ted McDonough, leads annual climate broadcast study. And what he found this year is that there was quite significant improvement in climate coverage, but it hasn't been consistent. And we're calling for more consistency in that climate coverage. And now we're pushing for the networks to go beyond just saying climate change and demanding accountability for the industry, the fossil fuel industry, that's driving most of the climate change and the consequences that come along with that.
Now, first of all, Brother Evlondo, the ruling itself.
Yes.
Help our audience understand that, because with everything else that happened, this was just something else that seemed a little more complicated to the layperson. And I don't know that everybody had the bandwidth after the trauma of all these other rulings, especially Roe. So first of all, help us understand exactly what the Supreme Court undermined with that ruling.
At a very high level, the Supreme Court undermined the EPA's ability to regulate harmful greenhouse gases that are created by power plants. This comes about, people remember the Clean Power Plan that President Obama proposed in 2015. It was a very ambitious policy proposal that was designed to address not only climate change, but also the pollution that fence line and frontline communities deal with. As a result of that, Trump repealed that, but that wasn't good enough for the Republican attorney generals and the fossil fuel industry and its political allies. They wanted to go directly at the EPA's ability to take climate action and regulate greenhouse gases. So they brought this decision, which the court accepted, and the court basically, it didn't go as far as they may have wanted it to, but it did severely constrain the EPA's ability to do its job and to regulate climate, regulate greenhouse gases. And address climate change.
And so what had been in place to do that regulation and make sure that we were becoming less dependent, less affected by the fossil fuel industry. The government and the Environmental Protection Agency can't do that anymore. Basically, it almost did it not render the EPA irrelevant in this area?
That was our fear. And I'm not a legal expert, but I've been trying to read a lot about this. They're still trying to decide how far the decision goes. What we can say unequivocally is that it has severely hindered the EPA's ability to do the job. And what's worse and more concerning, as a New York Times article that was published ahead of the decision noted, that this is a concerted strategy by the fossil fuel industry, Republican AGs. They're bringing these cases to a friendly Supreme Court that they in part funded to get them on the court in order to continue limiting the government's ability to take climate action. So although this EPA case may not have gone as far as they wanted, it's still a harmful case, but there are many more cases in the pipeline that could, compound the harm from this one case.
Now, what I like about this piece too, and folks, you can read this at MediaMatters.org. We'll link to it in the description for this show. The Supreme Court's EPA ruling is a major blow for climate action. Here's how national TV news should cover it. You all provide some guidelines. You're doing people's work for them. They need guidance. Amen. Folks pay millions of dollars to consultants to come up with stuff and they still get it wrong. Our brother's giving it to y'all for free. And we learn from the suggestions and guidelines that are being made here at Media Matters about how this should be covered, Brother Cooper. So talk to us about that. How should, you got several steps here, how should the industry be covering this?
Yeah, there are three main things, and I'm going to add a fourth in that too. One, they should cover how the decision is a victory for the fossil fuel industry. This is, like I said, this is a decades-long billion-dollar strategy that is yielding fruit that's going to benefit them but harm all the rest of us. That needs to be contextualized and reported on. You can't report on the story without that context. Two, they need to discuss not only how this hurts the EPA, but there are a lot of people, a lot of experts who are proposing ways that the government can still take climate action. So you need to report on how the EPA has been hobbled a little bit, but you also got to report on the strategies that still exist to get us to where we need to be in necessary climate action. Three, you need to bring on experts and climate activists and legal scholars who are versed in this work, environmental justice advocates, people who can speak to the particular issue, people who represent the communities that are going to be the most harmed by these policies, and give them a voice so they can kind of clearly articulate what's at stake for them and for the rest of us. And number four, which wasn't in my piece, but something that I've been giving thought to over the last few days with the rest of my team, this story definitely has a environmental justice frame to it. Like I said, the Clean Power Plan was lobbied for, improved by environmental justice groups who made it better. And the fossil fuel industry spent years after that eroding the plan, trying to kneecap Obama's ability to implement it, saying that the plan would actually harm socially marginalized communities, vulnerable communities, when it wouldn't, when actually it would have improved their lives. Trump rolled it back, and now the Supreme Court has used that as a jumping point to further erode the EPA's ability to protect these communities. That needs to be part of the story going forward as well.
You said something earlier, too, that was important, that the fossil fuel industry helped to finance some of these, I guess, nominations and rulings and finance a scenario for some of these people to end up on the court anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has done a lot of work on exposing all the dark money that comes to the court. Now, the dark money comes from groups across a range of issue areas, but it also comes from the fossil fuel industry. And they've worked really hard to finance legal societies, attorneys, judges who have a worldview, I'll just put it like that, that is friendly to their business. We talked about how I did a piece when Justice Amy Coney Barrett was being nominated, where Senator Whitehouse gave a very long presentation about the dark money network behind her nomination. That never became part of the larger story about her nomination.
Have you found any of the national or mainstream media since the ruling to take any of this advice or to improve in their coverage at all?
Yeah, I can preview something else that we're working on. We're working up on a follow-up piece about the coverage. I can say that the day one coverage, and this is a pattern that we've seen before, the day one coverage on CNN and MSNBC was pretty good. MSNBC definitely had the highest quality of coverage. CNN did a decent job of reporting the kind of top lines of the case, and Fox did what it does, which was celebrate, the decision and downplay climate change. What we see, though, is going forward since that day one coverage, which was pretty decent, we've seen a significant drop each day in the amount of coverage that the decision has received. And that's just something that we keep pushing towards, where even if they do a decent job day one covering it, by day 10, you don't hear about it anymore. And the issue becomes siloed away from larger coverage about climate change. And that's something we're pushing for, to say this decision should not be ignored or siloed. You did a good job reporting on it the day it happened. It must become part of your overall climate coverage so people understand what's really behind these decisions that are being made.
Admittedly, though, isn't part of the challenge that they're in a business,
Yes,
news industry.
Yes.
They're trying to sell and get it. And unfortunately, but see, let me finish my thought before I answer my own question. It's like, I think the thinking is everybody's so focused on every other thing that they think is so much more urgent. But the reason everybody thinks that is because the news media isn't covering it. If they were covering it more, people would understand, wait a minute, this is as urgent as the gun shooting.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's really what we're up against, trying to convince the media to help convince all of us that, what happened in Highland Park is absolutely urgent. But what's happening beneath the surface of that is imminent and upon us as well with climate change, right?
Yeah, I would never say that, one issue is more important than the other. All of the, like you mentioned at the beginning, all of these cases have ramifications and harms for a number of different concerned constituencies. What I would say is they should do a better investigative journalism. You're seeing corporate interests dictate policy in the United States, and it's harming all of us. The same corporations, the same industries that are funneling climate change are also the same ones funding any number of bad actions. The same corporations pumping guns into communities and fighting against gun control are the same ones that are trying to put hobble climate action and hobble climate change. So I don't think it's a story where each individual tragedy is siloed. I think the media needs to take a more intersectional, comprehensive view of the forces in this country that are harming all of our lives.
That's a word you said right there. He said his grandfather was a preacher. That was a word you just gave us right there.
Thank you very much.
Y'all hear what the brother said? The same entities that are wreaking havoc in all these other areas are intersected, and in fact, some of the same that are impacting climate change. That's heavy. No, that's really heavy. We don't think about that. We tend, without that national coverage and that reporting, we tend to silo that ourselves as a community. I think that's definitely something to think about. You said, though, that there's still some conversation going on as to how broadly the Supreme Court decision will impact us, right? That there's still some analysis going on. Where is that? Where are we in that process?
I think really what it's going to boil down to is how the Biden administration responds to the ruling. I think we'll see what they believe are their. I think we'll have a better sense of how far the ruling goes once we see what they come back with. And I'm sure there's some reporting on that. I haven't seen it yet, but I think, I do think that they'll have to come up with some creative solutions. And I've seen a couple of interviews with administration officials saying that they're working on, a response to it and working on how that the EPA can still continue its task, even in the wake of this harmful ruling.
So let me ask you another question, and I might ask you put your preacher hat back on for a minute. This is existential. Help us to understand what is going on with the climate and the way it's affecting all of us. Ultimately, is going to affect those in the fossil fuel industry. Those are human beings. They're going to be impacted too. If we're going to die, they're going to die.
Yes.
What is it about them and about the industry that simply refuses to do anything about it? I mean, it's as if they're more interested in financing everyone's demise, including their own. In the long run, it's going to impact them too.
Yeah, it's always an interesting question. I can tell you there's a project called Exxon New, which uncovered documents from the 70s and 80s, where Exxon's climate scientists have been so spot on accurate in what they predicted 20, 30, 40 years ago about what is happening now. They knew then. And since then, they've been fighting against reasonable climate actions that have taken 20 years ago. We would be in much better shape. What I can say is, and I can't speak for the average worker, people do what they feel to do to make ends meet. But for the executives, I think the executives feel they're going to be insulated from the consequences because of their money. I think it's completely reckless behavior, but I think the only way you can engage in these actions, knowing what they know, is if you think that it won't hurt you and yours. And I think that's partly what's driving a lot of these decisions, either the lack of ability to plan long-term, denial, or just thinking that, hey, it won't affect me. Me and my family and my friends will be fine.
Insulated by their money. Don't money, paper burn faster than flesh? That's what I thought.
From my understanding,
that's going to go quick. Flesh is next. It's close to it. Brother Cooper said to us folks that he's a native New Orleanian, third generation Evlondo. I can't help but ask, based upon your hometown, is what inspired you? Because again, this is an area where we need more people like you, not enough. So what inspired you to go down this lane and this path, Brother Evlondo, to deal with climate change and to write about it and to advocate for it in your writing, in your research?
I think it's a combination of circumstance and an opportunity. I mean, obviously, I was living in New Orleans when Katrina hit, and that had a tremendous impact. I mean, it changed my life. I haven't lived in New Orleans since. Thank goodness a lot of my family and friends have been able to relocate, but I haven't lived in the city since. And I think even as a young man, I had an understanding of the environment and climate, but seeing just how destructive nature could be up close and how it could scatter millions of people, I think it led me down a path of wanting to know not only how this can happen, but how we can stop it. And back then, attribution science was kind of in its infancy. So it wasn't, people were like, well, was Katrina really influenced by climate change? How much of at this point now, there's no doubt that the heat waves, the droughts, the wildfires that we're seeing, things that are impacting human life, the biodiversity collapse that are going to impact our ability to feed ourselves. These things are happening in real time and they're accelerating, and the window for action is closing. And so I think at this point, everyday people can see how it impacts them in their own lives. I don't understand. And even in the piece, poll after poll shows that people want the government to take climate action. This includes a majority of independents and a bare majority of Republicans. at a certain point, no matter who you are, where your ideological views lay, this issue is going to impact you. And I don't understand the continued disconnect between the media and reporting on this in a way that people can understand not just what's happening, which they can see in their backyard, but what solutions exist to mitigate it. And the government, which, you know, the government which has basically failed to protect us from a catastrophe that everyone can see on the horizon. Well, it's failing. You know, we'll see. You know, I have hope that they'll get their act together, but as of now, you know.
Now that we're talking about this, and ladies and gentlemen, I hope you think about this too. When we look at the national news cycle, the television news in particular, the 24-hour or less news cycle is often very repetitive. Same coverage, same story, loop, loop, loop. Now, to me, then there is room to cover this more. Because most of us, if we watch the national television news for an hour, we got it. Then the next hour, we're seeing the same thing over again. Now, most of us are programmed, we just keep the TV on and just hear the same thing over and over again until we actually memorize it, unfortunately. But imagine if there were more coverage and this was put into it, even to a smaller percentage more than it already is, and it's not much now. The difference that would make in terms of our overall awareness. When you agree, Evlondo? I mean, that's something they would think they'd be able to do.
I mean, you nailed it. I mean, studies have shown that when people see, read, and hear about climate change, but not just hearing about, you know, the scary part of it, which is very scary, but hear about ways they can take action, it galvanizes them. Part of my push for and our program's push to push the corporate news media to do better isn't because we want to see more doom and gloom stories, but we think that public policy solutions lie when people can actually see who's responsible for doing something wrong and what pathways exist to mitigate the worst consequences. It can actually drive people to be more participatory in their governments, whether it's the local, state, federal, regional level. But we don't see that. So people just kind of are stuck in this silo thinking, you know, these incidents are isolated and there's nothing they can really do about it, which breeds apathy.
You know, you're right. And we mentioned our brother's role. He's with the Climate and Energy Program at Media Matters. Have to ask you this. Have you all studied, does anybody know, in terms of national television media, mainstream media, not to mention print, and we know how that's contracting, those jobs. Do enough media even have climate beats, climate reporters, climate desks? Have we looked at that? Because I think that may be a place we need to look into as well.
No doubt newsrooms across the country, digital news outlets have taken a tremendous hit. And I think there are some very smart people trying to find a way to mitigate the erosion of journalism across this country, which is being more consolidated and repetitive. There are a couple of innovative initiatives covering climate now. I think once a year or twice yearly now, they have created kind of a network where you can share climate reporting, where they support smaller publications, smaller newspapers by helping provide them with good climate reporting or elevating their reporting to the national level so people can be more aware of issues at the local level. I think we need a lot more initiatives like that. I think we need a lot more support for local investigative journalism, which, you know, uncovers, like, you know, from Louisiana, I'm from Cancer Alley. You know, activists broke that story, but it took an engaged news media to bring it to the people. So I think you need a lot more investigative journalism to kind of uncover who's doing what, why, how. And, you know, I hope to see some kind of innovative model in the future that can support that kind of work.
No, that's precisely what we need. Lastly, I mean, here's some, I mean, you're part of the program, you're holding media accountable. I'm making you wear a lot of hats, though. I'll have you wear just one more before we go.
Yes,
just as someone who's who covers climate, who talks about it, who studies and understands it, give us a summary, if you would, in terms of where we stand right now as humankind? What's the clock like now, Evlondo? How imminently are we in greater danger than we've known before? We talking about 40 years, 30 years, even less than that? If you can give us sort of a glimpse of just what danger we're in.
Yeah, a lot of smart UN scientists puzzle over this. What I can say is, if we continue on the path that we're on, we're going to create a planet that is largely unlivable for a great number of people. I think the time to transition away from fossil fuels to mitigate some of these very scary impacts was yesterday. The next best time to do it is right now. And I think the sooner that we can get off of this fossil fuel intensive path, which, worries me because it seems like we're doubling down on fossil fuel production. But the sooner we can get away from this path towards a path of clean, renewable energy, the worst consequences that we'll suffer down the line.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think it's very urgent. And like I said, people can see it happening in their own backyards. They can feel it.
Right.
And the anecdotal evidence isn't the best evidence, but people across this country, across this world know that something is changing, something is different. And so I think with that knowledge that we need to pressure people in power to do something so that we can have a livable planet in the next 20, 30, 40, 100 years.
It's getting real, y'all. Check out Evlondo Cooper at MediaMatters.org. And of course, his latest piece, the Supreme Court's EPA ruling is a major blow for climate action. Here's how national TV news should cover it. You got a preview, brother, on the next project you're working on?
Yeah, like I mentioned a little bit ago, we're working on a follow-up piece that actually examines how it was covered the day of and then the ensuing few days. So we hopefully have that up in the next few days. And, we're going to keep pushing forward, demanding better coverage of this issue so that people were informed enough to take some necessary actions.
Amen. Evlondo Cooper, folks, MediaMatters.org. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.